Hey, how's it going? Before we get into the tutorial here, people are probably wondering, what is this system and what does it actually do? So here's an example right here really quick here. We have a bunch of lights that I just added into the scene. You notice that over here our FPS and our milliseconds here, we're up to about 35 milliseconds, and that's about between 28 and 30 frames per second. If you notice that if I go ahead and hit play, what it'll do is the farthest out from your character first, it'll start shutting the shadows off and retaining the shadows that are closest to your character. So that way we can get a little bit more performance out of it. And then if our FPS is caught back up, it'll start adding them back in. That's closest to the character first, where it's more important. Now, this doesn't mean that you should go ahead and add this many lights in your scene with this large of a radius. This is ridiculous. This is a terribly optimized scene, but I'm just showing you here to stress test the system to show you on the performance that you can achieve out of this system. Now, if you don't want to shut the shadows off, there is a second method here, and this one's fully automatic. This one will do, it'll start reducing the attenuation radius first, and if we still don't get any performance that we have achieved, then it'll start shutting off the shadows as well. Now remember, this will start at the farthest away from the character first and start moving its way in till we get that performance back. So here is a quick demonstration on that. This is a little bit slower of a method, but this is where you would use in a case if shadowing is very, very important that remains on. And again, if you have a scene that doesn't have this many lights in there, this process would go a lot faster because this is trying to manage a whole bunch of lights, a ridiculous amount of lights. And you notice that if we walk up to the wall here, if our FPS was caught up here, you notice it starts increasing the attenuation radius again because it knows that our system can now, our FPS is back up to our target goal. And it'll constantly analyze and keep that FPS up there. Again, like I said, if you had a smaller fraction of lights that are in there, and let's say a particle effect or something comes into your game to where it causes your FPS to drop, this will start reducing the lighting that's farthest away, out from the character first to get some performance back into it. And then once your FPS catches back up, it'll start adding them back in closest from the character out first. So that's essentially how this system works. So you can achieve great results with this if used properly. So stay tuned for the tutorial. Welcome to the tutorial here for the Smart Light system. This is a very powerful system for managing all of the lights in your scene. It'll optimize them in a very, very smart way. No pun intended. Let me show you here. This is just for demonstration purposes. You would never add this many lights with this large of a radius in a small area like this. But I'm just showing the power of this system on how it can actually optimize these lights for you. So let me go ahead and unselect here. Let's take a look at the frame rate. So the frame rate looks like it's about 28, 29, somewhere in there. So here is with the system disabled first. So let's take a look at this. Make that full screen here. So as soon as we go into the lit area, we can already see that we went up to about 29, 30 milliseconds. So that drops down our frame rate quite a bit. We're at about 25, 26 frames. And about 40 milliseconds, 42 actually. It's is pretty bad. So now, let's go through the same thing, but we'll run the system again. And this is with the smart system enabled. So you notice that our FPS that's up there, we're down to 17 milliseconds, as in before it was about 42 milliseconds. And as you can see, we still have the shadows and everything where we need them. It's optimizing and taking in the whole entire scene and checking your FPS. So as we get into the scene, you'll notice there's something strange going on there. That's the debug. And basically what this is doing is it's showing the areas in which it is optimizing the scene or changing optimization settings. Now, there's two different ways in which this is achieved with this system. One of them, the simple way, is to shut the shadows off. But if you shut the shadows off on all of your lights, well, then nothing really casts any shadows. So that's where this system shines, because it takes into what's in the viewport and changes all of your lighting based on what you can see and based on your FPS. So it's measuring that. Now, here's the two different methods in the case that if we look to the right over here, you'll notice there's no shadows, but if we get close enough to it and our FPS catches up, whoop, we just saw the shadows pop in. Now, in most cases, if you have a large level, most of the time, you're not going to see if you have the shadows turning on and off. However, there are areas to where you're definitely going to see it. So the second method, instead of just turning the shadowing on and off, like we have in this case, when the FPS catches up, the shadows, we can see them flip on there. However, in this side, we don't see the shadows pop in and out, but when the FPS catches up, you'll notice it gets a little bit brighter. So instead of turning the shadowing on and off, what it's doing is it's shrinking the attenuation radius to get a little bit more performance out of it. So it's not turning off the shadows in cases to where it's very important that shadowing remains on. So if we take a look at our scene here, you'll notice that these lights are different colors. What this is it's basically telling you, it's a visual representation of what mode these lights are in and how they function to get more performance. So the first one here, well, we'll go over the blue one. The blue one by default, when you drag a smart light into the scene, by default it'll be selected to only disable shadows. Now, in most cases, if you have a bunch of lights in your scene and let's say they're candles or torches or things like that you don't really care about, you can just leave this set to only disable shadows, and that will get you the most performance out of your scene. However, as we've seen earlier, that in this case, which you can see the shadows that just kind of just turn on, we want to use this other mode here, which is never disable shadows. So when this is red, it means it's not going to turn off the shadows at all. Instead, what it's going to do to save or get you extra performance is it's going to shrink the attenuation radius down. And by doing so, it's less area that it needs to cover, or less area that it needs to render, should we say. And then there is the third mode, which is over here, which is just your standard white one. If we don't have a check that is in the only disable shadows or the never disable shadows, and this is all blank here, this will turn white. And what this will do is it'll use a combination of both. It'll start shrinking the attenuation radius first, and if your scene still it's not meeting its threshold on what you set for your FPS, it'll shrink it and continue to shrink it to about half its size, and if you still doesn't get you the FPS, then it'll disable the shadows. So this is a combination of both. So before you add any lights to the scene, you need to drag in one of these smart managers. So how you do that is you can find it by typing smart manager, smart light manager, and this adds to the scene. If you notice down here, we have our minimum FPS and an FPS goal. What these are is essentially how this is working is the minimum is that if your frame rate drops beneath 50, it'll start optimizing the scene by doing or taking care of lights that are the farthest away from the actor first, and then moving towards the actor where it's least important, so that way you can start making up for performance in that way. And then the FPS goal, that's basically when does it start undoing those changes, basically, to where it'll either add the shadows back in or enlarge the radius again. That's where this FPS goal is. Now, a lot of people are just going to probably take this and just put it right at 60. The problem is with that is that if you have a game that's capped around 60, it never goes above that 60 because, and then the system will never add anything back in. So I recommend going at least a frame, at least 2 frames underneath whatever your target is. But ideally, though, this is around probably where it'll be set up if you're doing 60 FPS. The minimum, if you want to adjust this, you can pull this down. However, you cannot pull this any farther than it needs at least 5 frames that's in the middle. Found that's kind of where the sweet spot is, or else you're going to have items that are going to add, remove, add, remove, add, remove way too quick before it could actually monitor and see if we actually achieved any performance out of the scene. So hopefully that made sense. The debug zone that's down here is basically what you have seen earlier in the video, which I will go ahead and show you what these colors mean. So right now in the scene, every one of these lights, I just turned them all to basically just shutting shadows off. That's it. If it needs to find performance elsewhere. So if we go and look, if it's in that basic mode for shadows, red means it's off, green means the shadowing has been turned on. So you can see already that it's starting to reduce some of that. Found that our FPS came back up, so then it'll add it back to the scene. Same thing when we go to turn around. You'll notice that it starts adding and removing things. Now, if that's in a different mode, and let's say that all of these lights, which if we go and smart lights, and we go and select all of these, we will go and change the mode on this, and we will go and set that to fully automatic. So green is going to be where it's untouched. The next stage that it's going to hit is going to be blue. Technically, if you wanted to call it an LOD for it, blue would be the first step down. Then it's going to become yellow, and then it's going to be red, which means the red is where it shuts off shadows completely. So let me go ahead and drag a smart light into the scene here. So you notice over here in our panel, we can select what type of light we're going to be using. We can change this over here to different styles. If you're going to be using a spotlight, you can change it to that. You can change it to a point light. For now, we'll just be using the point light. So if we scroll down and we have the smart light setup. Under the point light settings is where it exposes all the parameters instead of going to click on the point light itself and then changing all the parameters there. It's more convenient to just have them in this area in case you want to just drag stuff around. Otherwise, if you're selected on something else and you go to drag it, you're not actually moving the zone, should I say. Which in some cases, that'll be a good thing. I'll show you what the zone is. So, if we go back here and we notice that have a draw zone, let's go ahead and turn that on. What this is we can change the activation area. In the case that you saw before, I just cranked this. I just cranked it up so that way every single light was overlapping your player. And when you're inside this box, it's simple. The system knows that this is a light that can be managed, and also it turns the light on. If you are outside of this zone, it'll remove the light from the system and it'll shut it off. It'll completely disable it, so that way it saves you for performance. Now, in this case, what we would do is we would move this zone or set it up to where can you see this light? Where should you be able to see this light? So let's say it's over here. And you notice down here that there's an activation zone size and there's an activation zone offset. So what we can do is we can actually drag and move this zone around, and we say, well, only in this area will that light be visible. So if you have lights that are in the room, so that means once you touch the green area, then this light will be activated. Otherwise, if you're outside the green area, it's a light to disable and completely ignore. So this draw zone that's down here makes it really, really easy to set up your zones. Now, let's go back down here and let's just turn up this turn up the attenuation so that way we can just see the light. There we go. So if we switch this out to a different type of light here, so you'll notice that this works the same identical way, but instead of under point light settings, you go under the other lights that you'll be using here. In this case, this rectangle light here, and you notice there's a rotation in here. This was added in here so that way you can turn and tip the light however you want and rotate it, because if you go and move the light, you'll notice that it's going to be paired to that zone. So if you just need to rotate the light, there's some rotation settings that are down here. But let's say after you place it and you still want to be able to move the light, well, then you can go down here and just click on your point light. You want to keep this all grouped together, and we can go and move this wherever we want. So that way it doesn't go ahead and move the zone. And the reason why I say point light instead of our rectangle light is because if you click on them, these need to be paired in the same area, because the system is tracking where's the point light, so it knows how to properly optimize what's on screen. So if you go to move any of these lights, make sure you just click just on the point light and move it as a group, and then you can move that around however you want. But if you have rotation settings that you need to do, well, then we can just go back to down here under our rectangle light, and we can adjust all the parameters here. And we can change it all there. The same thing goes with the spotlight. If we go ahead and click on the spotlight, We got spotlight settings that's down here. We can change our rotation based on that. Let's turn it up a little bit so we can see what's going on. And then where do we want that to shine? And we can also have it turn around in the scene too. So wherever we want to set that up. The last thing would be, how do we want this system to react? So in this case, you notice on the spotlight, the little light that's there on the edge is blue. That means that this is just going to shut off shadows. But in this case, if you're using a spotlight and you have something that's large in the middle of your room and this is shining on it, you're definitely going to see whether or not that shadowing is turned on and off. So in that case, I would come up here and let's change the color on that. We can actually have that never disable shadows. And you notice over here, the light turns red. It's shining out there. So which means now all it'll do to try and optimize the scene is pull in the attenuation radius. Just a quick little thing to add here for the lighting section of the tutorial. Make sure you always change your settings under your smart light setup that's down here, and change your settings here, your attenuation radius, all your stuff here. If you actually go to the light and make the adjustments here, you'll notice that it'll kind of fight you. It'll always snap back to a different position. In some cases, it won't snap back, but it's not using this information. It's going by what is underneath your point light settings here. So make sure you always change your settings under this section instead of actually clicking on the actual light itself. If you have other assets that are in your game that are poorly optimized, this will only take care of the lighting. It'll help you optimize it in that area. But if you have a terribly optimized game, getting up to that FPS, this system won't help you in those regards. But again, though, this would go a lot quicker if we set up those zones like we had set up earlier, because this system is fully managing every single one of these lights because they're all within these zones. And I just cranked them so that way your player would always be inside of them. So it's constantly managing all of these. So if you had a room to where you set up your zones to where you set them up properly to where if you can't see the light when they're not in that zone, then that would really cut this cost down. And then the system would only have to manage about maybe a 16th of this, and you'll get a lot better results and performance out of it. To set up your character to work with this system, it needs to know on your player's pawn, so that way it can keep track of how to properly optimize the scene. So there is only one thing that you do need to add to your character in order for this system to work, because if you didn't make it to this part of the tutorial, you probably added a bunch of lights in your scene, pressed play, and noticed they didn't even work. So that's because it's not picking up on what character needs to be in that zone. So this is really, really, really simple to set up here. There's only one thing that we need to basically do. Open up your character that you want to interact with this system. Go ahead and go to your class defaults, class settings. And then we're going to come down here and go to our implemented interfaces. We want to add an interface. It's very, very easy here. We just go smart, and you'll see a few of them here, but the one that we're looking for is the smart player interface. So go ahead and just add that, compile, save, and you'll see down here that there's an interface that was added. Just open that player setup, and it's asking for world location. All we're going to do is pull in our mesh, get world location, and plug it in. That is it. You are set up. and now it'll work with this system.